Hi, I'm Eric, and I'm a social studies educator, historian, and host of this, the Everything is a Primary Source podcast. I'm also an avid collector of popular culture artifacts. I love what I find at thrift store outlets, garage sale leftovers, and what I spot just making my way around the built world. I enjoy sorting through boxes of free books and magazines, not to mention online collections like Internet Archive, and of course the Library of Congress. But you don't need to spend your time digging through bins or following online rabbit holes to get a look into the past. The movies and TV we watch, the books we read, and the games we play are all documents of the past. So is fashion, food, music, toys, even the roads we travel on and the places we live and work in. Everything is a primary source. This podcast is the result of exhibiting these kinds of artifacts in public, getting passersby to select an item they connect with, and then chatting with me to see what it says about the time, place, and people who made it. The conversation you are about to hear, therefore, is your history, my history, our history, through popular culture.
There's also Salem, New Hampshire, which is nearby, and a lot of people get confused.
Yes.
And I only bring it up because the stereoscope photos that we got actually came from Salem, Massachusetts.
Okay.
So they're not of Salem, but they are, maybe one of them is. But I got them at an antique store, a junk store kind of place there. So that's what we're going to talk about. And they're very, like a lot of things we talk about on this podcast, visual.
Yes.
And there's so many of them out there. It's hard to say. I mean, what we're looking at is three of, I'd probably say millions of these things. But what is your connection with stereoscope photography?
Sure. So my background training is really in Greek and Roman history, but when I got into the high school setting, I started doing a lot of American history, and last year I had the pleasure of taking a webinar on teaching primary sources with the National History Day program.
Okay.
And so I was challenged there to basically do a simplified version of a National History Day project on an American topic, and I ended up getting very fascinated by stereoscopes, specifically of the Johnstown flood in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, in the late 19th century. And the thing that just really fascinated me about stereoscopes is that you just look at them today and you just think, oh, they're just two images right next to each other. What you have to keep in mind is that the person who made these images, they were not intending them to just be seen this way. They were intended to be seen with a special scope so that the images would be sort of flickering back and forth quickly to give some illusion of depth.
Okay. That's a great, I'm going to ask a follow-up real quick. I'm just going to throw in there that we're going to talk about the material it's made from.
Yep.
And you're already down that path because would it happen where a photographer, these are almost always photographs that are being used.
Yep.
That would their work ever be used as a stereoscope, even if they didn't intend for it to be that way? Or was it a specific technique that you had to take the photograph to make it work that way?
So it's my understanding that these photographers were definitely thinking about this in mind. So, for example, I got really intrigued by this because there's some photographs of this disaster area that had things like trees that were sort of pointed directly at the viewer in the photo. So it's like, oh, that would be very dramatic if you had some sense of depth in there. So going to the photos or the stereoscopes that we have right here. So here we have one of, it's a Christmas scene. We can see 5 kids crammed into a bed. But then in front of the bed, there's this very tall stack of blocks. And then behind the bed, there's actually a window, and then there's someone like sort of sticking their head out of the window. And so this is a photograph that has a lot of depth to it, and that's going to be accentuated when you're actually looking at this through a stereoscope screen, because it's kind of like you are trying to think about the difference between a 3D movie and a 2D movie, where the 3D movie, like, it only makes sense to go to a 3D movie if they're going to be playing around with the depth. If they're not going to be playing around with the depth, you might as well just go see a regular movie.
Right. Which, side note, about 10 years ago, that was the future of movies. They were like, everything from now on will be 3D. And I couldn't help but think about things like this. I mean, both movies had been through a 3D era, mid-century, but this has been around for a while. It's not the only way that we look at photographs.
Yep.
But when it comes to something like a disaster, like a flood, that's another way of looking at the material. Yep. So the subject matter for these would be a wide array of things. It wasn't just specific. What we're looking at here is a telling of "'Twas the Night Before Christmas."
Yep.
And I assume there's probably a series of those for each part of the poem.
Yep. Yeah.
When it comes to something like a disaster, tell me more about that. Why would they make Stereoscope, which is like kind of entertainment-ish, out of a terrible thing?
Yeah, so you have to think about the material culture here quite seriously, because this is different than a postcard, which is actually part of the reasons why these fall out of favor, is that in the early 1900s, the U.S. postal system basically allows for postcards in a way that they hadn't before, and then that completely drives the stereoscopes out of business, in part because for stereoscopes it only made sense, you had to buy the special machine and then build up a library of images. And my understanding is that the people who would buy those machines, build up the library of images, they wanted a combination of things that are both like sort of sentimental, like this Christmas image, but then they also wanted things of educational value too. So you have a lot of images of buildings that we would associate with like what in the 19th century was called the Grand Tour of Europe. So a lot of images of Rome, of Paris, of London. But the other key way to justify the purchase of the special viewing machine and then this sort of library of things was that education, but then so news relates to that as well. So you'd want to show, so this Johnstown flood's the most serious quote-unquote man-made disaster at that point in the 1890s. So you're educating yourself and your neighbors who you invite over to your living room, your parlor, to view these materials.
Do we see continuity in those attitudes? Because I know that it can, because of its connections to entertainment, right? It could have connotations of being insensitive.
Yep.
Right? And I think it was at Coney Island, they had an earthquake simulator to give people the experience of the San Francisco earthquake on the other side of the country.
Yeah.
And that comes across as like, that's demented. That's kind of weird that you would want to, but is it though? I mean, is actually more of an empathetic kind of take on it?
Yeah, it definitely could be, because at the end of the day, the image is an image. It's just there, and it's the question of interpretation that you're raising is going to be one that's about the audience, about the intended audience, and you can sort of try to get at what the photographer's intended audience was. So going back to the Christmas one we have here, what I'm noticing is on the top it says Underwood and Underwood Publishers, New York, London, Toronto, Canada, Ottawa, Kansas. And then on the back we actually see "'Twas the Night Before Christmas" in 6 different languages. So they definitely intended an international audience with this particular card. Sort of going back to the combination of education and entertainment and sort of sensationalism. Yeah, it can be hard because in those Johnstown flood images, there were images of bodies occasionally, and that goes back to really the earlier period of photographs in United States history during the Civil War, where we see images of corpses on the battlefield that the photographers sometimes moved around in order to create more artistic displays. So in short, there's sort of an ethics that they were still figuring out at that time that now would professional journalism, there's very clear rules and expectations around those kinds of things.
Clearly, don't drop a microphone on your lap when you're trying to have a conversation. And so with stereoscopes, therefore the material is wide open, right?
Yep.
I mean, you could. Was this a precursor? I mean, the obvious one would be the name escapes me right now, but the clicker one that we. I've done a podcast on it before too.
Yes, I'm thinking of the thing you put up right to your
right. Yeah, Viewmaster.
Viewmaster, yes.
It's those are related because, and I have memories of being a kid. I had a Viewmaster. I would pop in national parks.
Yep.
Disney characters, and I never got to go to Disney World when I was a kid, so It was a fun way to go to Disney World without actually going there.
Yep.
But there's obviously a relationship between those two things. Do we have other media forms? You mentioned postcards.
Yep.
Into the motion picture era that would be using the same kinds of materials as stereo, or maybe for the same purposes.
Yeah, you're reaching the limits of my knowledge there, because stereoscopes, as I mentioned, they end up competing with postcards, losing there, and then in a sense, you're right, they end up competing with film and losing there. You might be thinking film, the timeline doesn't quite line up there. We do have to remember the Nickelodeons that were competitors with the movie theaters that obviously we're still familiar with, whereas Nickelodeons have bit the dust pretty quickly.
In a way, though, I mean, and so for one thing, stereoscopes would get somebody prepared
for the
Nickelodeon, because it's a very similar kind of even posture that you would. Different setting. I mean, you could do this in a parlor. Nickelodeons, you have to go to the Nickelodeon.
Yep.
We've seen a full circle when it comes to Nickelodeons.
That's true.
Because people favor, especially for funny videos, short clips.
Yep.
Very low budget, sometimes no budget. Just kind of, move on to the next one. And that's, and then for, virtual reality. I know that like the Meta, I don't know what it's called, but the goggle things that they have. I remember back when I was a kid, they tried VR. That was like gonna be the new thing, and it failed miserably because it's not good. Technology wasn't there yet, but it's there now. And it's the same kind of things. You can do it for fun. You can do it for education. You can immerse yourself. So it's like it reveals that at least for the last 200 years, if not longer, it's a natural human urge. You want to remove yourself from place and location. You want to be able to get information, entertainment.
Yeah, no, that's right. It's an urge that comes up again and again, and for whatever reason, the 3D part seems to always be butting up against something that prevents it from becoming widespread in a way that these 2D images just seem to have an advantage for whatever reason.
Well, Tristan, I really appreciate you taking the time.
Of course.
This is what we do here, and I think this is going to be another great installment of Everything as a Primary Source. Thank you again.
Popular culture, by definition, connects and unites us, and proves that people of different backgrounds, in fact, have a lot in common with one another. I hope you enjoyed this conversation, at least in part, for that reason. If it connects with you and you'd like to add to it, or any of the podcast episodes, just visit everything-history.com and search for the Everything as a Primary Source project, which can be found in the classroom section of the website. We'd love to hear what you have to say. Be sure to rate and share this podcast wherever you are listening to it now, and follow Everything as a Primary Source on social media, including YouTube and especially Instagram. Thank you for listening to the EPS podcast, where everything is a primary source.